The World in Pictures, and Time, the weekly news magazine, present on television the exclusive picturization of General Dwight D. Eisenhower's book, Crusade in Europe.
As the situation then stood in Italy, it was apparent that a steady advance up the peninsula demanded a succession of outflanking operations. Head-on attacks against the enemy on his mountainous frontiers would be slow and extremely costly. The real question to be decided was whether the overall interests of the Allies would be best served by allocating to the Italian operation sufficient resources to maintain momentum in the advance, or whether, on the contrary, we should content ourselves with minor, well-prepared attacks in the mountains with limited aims, but with maximum economy in men and resources.
Shortly before Christmas, 1943, General Eisenhower made a tour of the front lines in Italy. Our advance against the enemy was proceeding slowly, and in many places was bogged down owing to the weather. One of the chief reasons for the General's tour of inspection at this particular time was to try to give a lift to the morale of the men at the front. In addition to coping with the bitterly resisting Nazis, the GIs faced the overwhelming problem of functioning in a quagmire of mud. The Italian campaign was ranked with the toughest waged in the war. The terrain was treacherous. The physical problem of moving forces of men and quantities of equipment in the rugged country was an enormous one. Waging a war in such country required inexhaustible energy. In the mountainous areas, where most of the heavy fighting was centered, the GIs had to make their way painstakingly up to the summits, staggering under the weight of shells they would shortly fire at the enemy.
Carefully planned minor offensives comprised the campaign I used during the winter, amidst the inescapably miserable conditions of the Italian mountains. Yankee ingenuity and resourcefulness were tested to the limit. The terrain was cut up by rivers, large and small, which ran athwart the route of advance. Some of these were so winding that they had to be crossed several times.
The Volturno, which the Allies first crossed in October, was such a river, winding back and forth across the path of their advance. Now swollen by the heavy rains, it became a continuing problem to Allied forces. Since the supply route to the front up ahead must be kept open at all costs, it was imperative that a thoroughfare across the rivers be maintained in usable condition. In December 1943, this assignment was an extremely difficult one. The pontoon bridge, capable of being constructed quickly, was used to great advantage many times during the early years of the war. But occasionally, in critical conditions, it proved not durable enough. In Italy, as in all theaters of the war, casualties were not always the result of direct enemy action. To work out final plans for an Allied flanking movement by a new landing to the north, which he had at first opposed, General Eisenhower departed for Tunisia.
The matter for discussion was a proposed amphibious operation against Anzio, to be launched in January.
The invasion was mounted at the port of Naples, which had been virtually demolished by the retreating Nazis only 3 months before. Preloaded supply trucks were used for the first time in the Mediterranean theater. The invasion fleet of small ships was to head north up the coast for 120 miles and put into shore quietly at Anzio. The Allies hoped to capture the small port there before the Nazis had the opportunity to demolish it. Its seizure intact would lighten considerably the problem of supply over beaches exposed to enemy fire. The plan called for a quick strike at the enemy's flank, with fast-moving motorized units playing an essential role. Selected to make the important landing at Anzio was the American 6th Corps, composed of Allied troops who had seen months of action in North Africa, Sicily, and in the Italian campaign to date. Their mission was to seize the port at Anzio, clear out the coastal defense batteries, and proceed inland to engage the enemy, to divert him from his defense of the main front to the south. The invasion fleet put out to sea the day before D-Day, which was set for January 22nd, 1944. Surprise was to be the keynote of the assault. It worked perfectly. Without the customary pre-invasion bombardment, 6th Corps troops swarmed ashore. The enemy was caught completely off guard. So far, the operation was an easy success.
Military strategy may bear some similarity to the chessboard, but it is dangerous to carry the analogy too far. A threatened king in chess must be protected. In war, he may instead choose to fight. The Nazis had not instantly withdrawn from Africa or Sicily merely because of threats to their rear. On the contrary, they had reinforced and fought the battle out to the end. In this case, of course, one of the principal objects was to induce the enemy to reinforce his Italian armies. But it was equally important that this be done in such a way that our own costs be minimized.
But the Nazis did not overlook the Anzio landing force for long. Before the evening of the first day, the Germans reacted swiftly to meet the emergency. New divisions were rushed into Italy from other fronts, and fresh forces were thrown into the battle to stem the advance of the Allied Anzio force. By the morning of the second day, the Germans opened fire in a desperate attempt to wipe out the Allied beachhead. The target area for the savage German attack, Anzio, was badly battered in a few days' time. The Allies quickly consolidated their position and prepared to defend their limited beachhead area stubbornly against any Nazi counterattack, however strong. Every protective measure possible was taken to help assure our effective defense of that position. The first German assaults had been withstood successfully, but the Allied troops were fully aware that the Nazis were far from finished with them.
In the final outcome, the Anzio operation paid off handsomely, but in its initial stages, it developed exactly as my headquarters thought it would. Before real results were achieved, the Anzio force had to be built up to more than 6 divisions and had to fight under adverse conditions for some 4 months. On the other hand, the move undoubtedly convinced Hitler that we intended to push the Italian campaign as a major operation. This was a great advantage to the Allies elsewhere.
As a further precautionary measure, mines were planted liberally to harass the Nazis in the event that they succeeded in overrunning our lines. It was by now fairly evident that the enemy was massing for an attack in great force. The Allied Anzio force was fortunate in gaining a little time in which to make thorough preparations for meeting the attack. To counter the expected Nazi assault on their beachhead, the Allies prepared for immediate use every type of heavy artillery piece which they had succeeded in bringing ashore before being pinned down by the Nazi shelling. It was probable that the enemy did not know how much firepower we had concentrated in our beachhead area, and Allied commanders ordered that every possible device be used to prevent them from finding out ahead of time. The Allies used the time to good advantage. After 2 weeks of relative quiet, the enemy commenced their major counterattacks. The Nazi heavy assault was directed by Field Marshal Kesselring, who commanded Axis forces in Italy. The Germans were finally ready to launch their drive to force the 6th Corps troops back into the sea. For 4 weeks, the Nazis gave it everything they had. The Allies suffered considerable losses, in equipment as well as in men. The destruction of quantities of materiel made it that much more difficult for the Allies to defend their hard-won foothold. One of the most effective protective measures was quickly taken. A smoke screen composed of 100 gallons of oil to every 8 gallons of water, compressed into a milky fog, was spread across the Allied beachhead, covering an area of many miles along the coast. But with all our best protective measures, we still suffered heavily under the full weight of the determined Nazi attack. Allied casualties were heavy during the 30-day German assault. Hundreds of GIs killed and thousands wounded. At their underground headquarters, Allied commanders of the 6th Corps rushed plans for an all-out attack upon the reinforced German divisions facing them. The disadvantage of a limited position from which to operate was supplemented by the Allied need for more men and materiel. But the 6th Corps attack could not be held up to wait for any possible attempt to bring reinforcements in by sea. The attack was organized with all possible speed. Every weapon we had was pressed into service as the assault got started. We hit them with everything. Railway-mounted naval guns, 90mm anti-aircraft, packed howitzers, .75s from Sherman tanks, self-propelled 105s on tank chassis, 155, and the 8-inchers. After the softening up, our tanks went into action. The back of the enemy's resistance was broken, and the men with the rifles moved forward to press the attack. The Nazis were pushed back, but our bombers continued to harass their retreat. The battle-weary GIs finally had an opportunity to enjoy a few moments' respite after the exhausting hours of continuous heavy action. Our attack was once again on the move, and from this point on, the Axis in Italy was fighting a delaying war. During the violent battle at Anzio, the Nazis suffered countless casualties, and thousands of crack German troops from such elite units as the Hermann Goering Division were captured by the Allies. But the Allies, too, had paid a tremendous price. During the first 30 days of the operation in and beyond Anzio, the combat casualties of the 6th Corps amounted to 17% of its effective strength. British combat losses were relatively heavier than American in terms of the number of troops engaged. The British units lost 27% of their effective strength during the same period. In 4 months, about 33,000 casualties were evacuated by sea from Anzio, including 24,000 Americans, without the loss of a single patient's life as a result of the process of moving men from shore hospitals to the waiting ships. But there were nearly 5,000 other Allied troops who were not evacuated. Arriving in London in the early weeks of 1944, General Eisenhower conferred with his staff officers on the highly complex preparations for Operation Overlord, the long-awaited invasion across the Channel.
Now began again the task of preparing for an invasion. But by comparison with the similar job of a year and a half earlier, order had replaced disorder, and certainty and confidence had replaced fear and doubt.
From the United States came hundreds of thousands of freshly trained GIs, swelling to gigantic proportions the force which was to participate in the greatest invasion in history. The nucleus for this invasion force was formed by the battle-tested veterans of the campaigns in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy during the grim year and a half just past. From puny beginnings, the U.S. Army was now grown into one mighty offensive weapon with one objective.
My headquarters was officially called Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, and taking the initials from the name, SHAPE was born.